The diplomatic chessboard has been reset once again. On March 11, 2025, America's Secretary of State Marco Rubio declared that the ball is back in Vladimir Putin's court, following Ukraine's agreement to a US-brokered month-long ceasefire plan. This pivotal moment marks a critical juncture in a war that has raged for over 3 years. After a spectacular and widely reported Oval Office confrontation between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky just 11 days earlier, few expected such rapid diplomatic movement. The temporary halt in American weapons shipments that followed their heated exchange has now been reversed. But whether this diplomatic breakthrough leads to lasting peace or becomes another footnote in this bloody conflict depends entirely on one man, Vladimir Putin. For perhaps the first time since his tanks rolled across Ukraine's borders in February 2022, it is Putin who faces a decision that could define his legacy and Russia's future. The question that now hangs over the conflict zones of eastern Ukraine is deceptively simple. Will Putin agree to the ceasefire terms that Ukraine has accepted? To understand the gravity of this moment, we must first recognize what a ceasefire would mean for each party. For Ukraine, a pause in hostilities offers critical breathing room after months of territorial losses along the eastern front. Ukrainian forces have been hampered by ammunition shortages and combat fatigue, with defensive positions gradually crumbling under the weight of Russia's numerical advantage. The Ukrainian military has lost an estimated 120,000 to 150,000 soldiers, according to Western intelligence assessments, though Kyiv disputes these figures. For Russia, the calculations are more complex. Putin's war machine has sustained catastrophic losses between 150,000 and 210,000 dead, according to US intelligence estimates, though Moscow has never acknowledged such figures. Russian public opinion has slowly shifted as the casualties mounted, with recent polling suggesting growing war fatigue among ordinary citizens. The diplomatic context has been fundamentally altered by Donald Trump's return to the White House. His administration's approach to Ukraine differs dramatically from his predecessors, with Trump repeatedly questioning the extent of American support. The reported shouting match between Trump and Zelensky on March 1st centered around Trump's insistence that Ukraine should negotiate directly with Russia, while Zelensky maintained that doing so from a position of weakness would be national suicide. What's particularly noteworthy about this ceasefire proposal is its origin. It was crafted by American diplomats working under Secretary Rubio, with significant input from Steve Witkoff, Trump's personal envoy, who has been shuttling between capitals. This represents the most direct American involvement in peace efforts since the conflict began. Vladimir Putin now faces what military strategists call a decision point, a moment where all potential choices carry significant risk. To understand Putin's dilemma, we must first acknowledge what he has and has not achieved in Ukraine. His initial objectives, as outlined in his speeches and writings, were ambitious: to subjugate Ukraine, sever its Western connections, remove Zelensky's government, and permanently neutralize Ukraine as a security threat to Russia. Instead, after 3 years of grinding warfare and catastrophic losses, Russia has managed to capture approximately 11% of Ukrainian territory beyond the roughly 7% it seized in 2014. Most of these gains are in the eastern Donbas region, with many areas now reduced to rubble by Russia's own artillery. By any reasonable assessment, the end has not justified the means. From Moscow's viewpoint, a temporary ceasefire presents significant risks. It would give Ukrainian forces time to regroup, retrain, and potentially receive new Western equipment. It could solidify the current battle lines, making further territorial gains more difficult. Most concerning for Putin, it might give Ukraine breathing room to stabilize its economic and military position. However, refusing the ceasefire carries its own dangers. Rejecting a peace initiative that Ukraine has already accepted would position Russia as the intransigent party, potentially reinvigorating Western support. It would particularly anger Trump, who values being seen as a successful dealmaker and who has openly expressed frustration with both sides in the conflict. The proposed ceasefire would temporarily freeze the current battle lines while negotiations on more permanent arrangements proceed. What many analysts miss is that Putin may actually prefer the diplomatic table to the battlefield at this juncture. With Trump in the White House questioning NATO's purpose and pushing Ukraine to compromise, Putin may calculate that he can achieve through negotiation what has proven costly and elusive through combat. Specifically, he might secure formal recognition of territorial gains, guarantees against Ukraine joining NATO, and the lifting of painful economic sanctions. Donald Trump's approach to the Ukraine conflict represents a dramatic departure from the policies of the Biden administration. Trump has repeatedly expressed skepticism about continued American support for Ukraine, questioning both its cost and strategic value to the United States. His public statements have sometimes echoed Kremlin positions, including characterizing Zelensky as dictatorial for postponing elections during wartime. These positions have created significant anxiety among NATO allies about American commitment to collective security. The reported Oval Office confrontation between Trump and Zelensky on March 1st represents a nadir in U.S.-Ukrainian relations. According to multiple sources familiar with the meeting, Trump demanded that Ukraine accept territorial concessions in exchange for continued American support, while Zelensky insisted that Ukraine's sovereignty was non-negotiable. The meeting reportedly ended with Trump ordering an immediate halt to weapons shipments and intelligence sharing. Trump's decision to restart military aid following Ukraine's acceptance of the ceasefire proposal suggests he is pursuing a carrot-and-stick approach to force diplomatic progress. What makes this diplomatic initiative particularly interesting is how it has been structured. Secretary of State Rubio and Special Envoy Witkoff have carefully crafted an agreement that gives Trump a potential diplomatic victory while allowing Ukraine to avoid making immediate territorial concessions. The approach bears striking similarities to Trump's business negotiation tactics described in his books, creating pressure, forcing concessions, then offering relief in exchange for agreements that serve his interests. In this case, the pressure was applied to Ukraine first, but may now shift to Russia. This diplomatic dance between Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow reverberates far beyond Eastern Europe. In Western Europe, leaders have watched Trump's Ukraine policy with growing alarm. French President Macron and German Chancellor Scholz have both publicly emphasized Europe's need to develop strategic autonomy, interpreting Trump's actions as further evidence that America may no longer be a reliable security guarantor. This has accelerated discussions about expanded European defense cooperation, independent of the United States. In Beijing, Chinese leadership is studying this diplomatic episode with intense interest. How Trump manages relations with both Ukraine and Russia could provide insights into how he might approach Taiwan and cross-strait tensions. The precedent being set regarding territorial integrity and great power relations has implications that extend far beyond Ukraine's borders. For the global South, the conflict continues to have profound economic implications. Any ceasefire, even temporary, would likely ease pressure on global food prices, as Ukraine's agricultural exports have been severely constrained by the conflict. Nations in Africa and the Middle East that depend heavily on Ukrainian grain have suffered significant food insecurity as a direct result of this war. The diplomatic breakthrough, if it holds, could represent the first meaningful de-escalation since the conflict began. However, it remains precariously balanced on Putin's response. Will he seize this opportunity to extract diplomatic concessions, or will he perceive it as a trap designed to expose Russia as the obstacle to peace? Based on current trajectories and historical patterns, we can outline three potential paths forward, each with distinct probabilities and implications. In the first and most optimistic scenario, Putin accepts the ceasefire proposal with minimal conditions. The fighting pauses across all front lines, allowing both sides to regroup while diplomats work toward more comprehensive arrangements. This scenario would likely see intense diplomatic activity in neutral locations such as Turkey or Switzerland, with negotiators focusing first on humanitarian issues like prisoner exchanges and civilian evacuations. Trump would claim a major foreign policy victory, potentially enhancing his domestic political position. The probability of this scenario depends heavily on Putin's assessment of whether time favors Russia or Ukraine. If he believes that Ukraine's Western support will continue to waver regardless of the ceasefire, he may calculate that a diplomatic path now offers better returns than continued fighting. In the second and most likely scenario, Putin agrees to the ceasefire but attaches conditions that complicate implementation. These might include demands for Ukraine to withdraw from specific contested areas, international recognition of Russian territorial gains, or guarantees about Ukraine's future NATO status. This approach would put Trump in a difficult position, forced to either pressure Ukraine to accept Russian conditions, or watch his ceasefire initiative collapse. It would test the cohesion between Washington and Kyiv, while allowing Putin to position himself as open to peace on reasonable terms. This strategy mirrors Putin's approach during previous negotiations, including the Minsk agreements of 2014 and 2015, where ambiguity in the terms allowed Russia to continue pursuing its objectives while claiming to support peace. In the third and most concerning scenario, Putin rejects the ceasefire outright, or makes demands so unreasonable that they amount to rejection. This would likely be accompanied by a significant military escalation designed to strengthen Russia's position before any future negotiations. Such a response would severely test Trump's commitment to Ukraine and potentially create a rift between the United States and its European allies over how to respond. It would also risk triggering the very outcome Putin hopes to avoid: renewed Western unity and expanded military support for Ukraine. Each of these scenarios contains numerous variables and potential branch points. Putin's decision will likely be influenced by internal Russian political considerations, military assessments, and intelligence about Western resolve that remain opaque to outside observers. As we await Putin's response, it's worth considering the unique historical moment we find ourselves in. Throughout history, protracted conflicts have often reached inflection points where relatively small decisions produced outsized consequences. The current diplomatic initiative may represent such a juncture in the Russia-Ukraine war. Putin has repeatedly demonstrated that he takes a long view of history and Russia's place in it. His writings and speeches reveal a leader deeply concerned with reversing what he perceives as the humiliation of Russia following the Soviet collapse. Any decision he makes regarding the ceasefire will be filtered through this historical lens. Meanwhile, millions of Ukrainians continue to endure daily bombardments, power outages, and the constant threat of Russian advances. For them, a ceasefire, even temporary, would provide precious respite from the constant fear and destruction that has defined their lives for 3 years. The human cost of this conflict has been staggering. Beyond the military casualties, thousands of Ukrainian civilians have perished, millions have been displaced, and entire cities reduced to rubble. These human realities should inform our understanding of the stakes involved in Putin's decision. What makes this moment particularly consequential is that for the first time, all three key players, Russia, Ukraine, and the United States under Trump, face powerful incentives to find a diplomatic off-ramp, albeit for entirely different reasons. This rare alignment of incentives, however temporary, creates a window of opportunity that didn't exist even a month ago. As we conclude our analysis, it's worth emphasizing several key insights about this critical juncture in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. First, the proposed ceasefire represents a significant shift in the diplomatic landscape, largely driven by Trump's unconventional approach to Ukraine policy. While his methods have generated controversy, they have undeniably altered the strategic calculations of all parties involved. Second, Putin now faces a genuine dilemma. A temporary halt in fighting does not obviously favor Russia's military position, yet rejecting a peace initiative that Ukraine has accepted carries significant diplomatic costs. His decision will reveal much about Russia's true objectives and assessment of its strategic position. Third, the peace process, even if initially successful, faces enormous challenges. The fundamental issues that triggered this conflict, Ukraine's geopolitical orientation, NATO expansion, and Russia's sphere of influence, remain unresolved. Any ceasefire would merely pause the fighting while these deeper tensions continue to simmer. We're curious to hear from you. Do you believe Putin will accept the ceasefire proposal, and what conditions might he attach? What would you consider a just resolution to this conflict? At Omni, we'll continue tracking these developments with daily updates as this critical diplomatic situation unfolds. Our team of regional experts provides analysis you won't find in mainstream coverage, including insights from sources within all three capitals. The world now watches as Vladimir Putin contemplates his next move on the geopolitical chessboard. His decision won't just determine the immediate future of Ukraine, it will shape the international order for years to come. For the citizens caught in this struggle, for regional stability, and for the principle that borders should not be changed by force, the stakes could not be higher. As Secretary Rubio said, the ball is now in Putin's court. The question remains whether he will play it toward peace or continued conflict.